The August air in Savannah was thick enough to drink, a heavy, sweet cocktail of salt marsh, jasmine, and old money. Inside the Sinclair estate, a stately Georgian manor overlooking the Wilmington River, the air was different. It was cool, conditioned, and smelled of success. Jeremiah Sinclair, a man carved from ambition and draped in bespoke linen, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study. At 42, he had built a logistics empire from the ground up, a testament to relentless drive that had made him one of the most powerful black men in the South. His reflection in the glass was a portrait of control, a sharp jawline, intelligent eyes, and a physique that spoke of disciplined early mornings in his home gym. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a legacy in the making, a story of triumph he was ready to pass on. His wife, Celeste Fontaine, glided into the room, a vision of effortless grace. A former ballerina from New Orleans, she moved with a dancer's poise that made the cavernous rooms feel like her personal stage. She carried a tray with a single glass of iced sweet tea, a perfect Georgia welcome. Her belly, round and prominent under a white sundress, was the centerpiece of their perfect life. In 8 months, it had become the focal point of Jeremiah's world, the vessel carrying his heir, his future, his validation. He had named the boy already, Samuel, after his own father, a dock worker who had dreamed of a life his son was now living. Jeremiah turned from the window, his stern expression melting into one of rare, unguarded tenderness. "How's my boy doing today?" he asked, his voice a low rumble as he placed a hand on her stomach. Celeste smiled, a slow, enchanting curve of her lips. "He's quiet, saving his energy, I think." She leaned into his touch, the picture of maternal bliss. "I was just on the phone with my cousin Nia. She's so excited to come for the baby shower." Jeremiah nodded, his mind already calculating the logistics of her family's travel from Louisiana. He prided himself on taking care of everything, on providing a world so seamless and secure that his wife and child would never know a moment of want or fear. He had recently amended his will, a move his lawyers called prudent. A significant asset, a state-of-the-art warehouse facility near the port, the crown jewel of his recent expansions, was to be placed in a trust for Samuel upon his birth. It was more than a gift. It was a statement. The Sinclair legacy was already being built for the next generation. Later that evening, after Jeremiah had retreated back to his study to oversee a late-night shipping crisis in Singapore, Celeste slipped out onto the veranda. The air was alive with the thrum of cicadas, and the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks swayed like ghostly veils. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over Nia's name before pressing the call button. The enchanting smile was gone, replaced by a mask of taut anxiety. "Is everything ready?" she whispered, her voice stripped of its melodic southern charm, now sharp and urgent. "The package is ready whenever you are." Nia's voice crackled back, laced with a nervous energy that mirrored Celeste's. "The doctor's files are clean. The story is solid. You just have to play your part for the final act." Celeste took a deep, shuddering breath, her free hand instinctively going to her stomach, not with a mother's caress, but with a strange, proprietary pat, as if checking on a piece of equipment. "He's finalized the will, Nia, the warehouse. It's done." A beat of silence passed between them, thick with the weight of their conspiracy. "Good," Nia said finally. "Just be careful, Celeste. This isn't a game." Celeste ended the call and stared out into the oppressive darkness of the low country night. A firefly blinked in the distance, a fleeting spark of light in the overwhelming gloom. She was careful. She had been careful her entire life. This was the most elaborate performance she had ever staged, and she had no intention of letting the curtain fall before the final bow. She ran a hand over her perfectly round belly. It was warm to the touch, weighted, and felt astonishingly real. But beneath the layers of meticulously crafted silicone and fabric, there was nothing. No life, no heartbeat, no son named Samuel. There was only the hollow echo of a desperate gamble, a secret so profound it had the power to build a fortune or burn her entire world to the ground. To understand Celeste Fontaine, you had to leave the manicured lawns of Savannah and travel back to the sticky, chaotic heart of the New Orleans French Quarter. There, she was not Celeste, the graceful ballerina. She was born Charles, a scared, lanky boy trying to survive in a world that had no place for him. The story of a prestigious ballet career was a fiction, a beautiful lie woven to cover the jagged scars of a brutal reality. Her stage was not the orchestra hall, it was the unforgiving streets where survival was a desperate daily improvisation. She had transitioned young, a painful and isolating journey, undertaken with little money and no support system. The grace Jeremiah saw in her was not from dance training. It was the hyper-vigilant poise of someone who had learned to navigate a hostile world, to be beautiful and unassuming to avoid becoming a target. Her life was a tapestry of low-wage jobs, cramped apartments, and the constant gnawing fear of being discovered, of being hurt, of being erased. She met Jeremiah Sinclair at a catering event she was working in Atlanta. He was a guest, a titan of industry whose quiet confidence and commanding presence seemed to emanate from another universe. To him, she was an exotic flower, a delicate creature with a mysterious past. To her, he was a lifeline. He represented not just wealth, but safety. He was a fortress, and she would do anything to get inside its walls. The plan was born from desperation during a tearful late-night call with her cousin Nia. Nia was the only family she had left, the only person who knew her entire truth. "He wants an heir more than anything," Celeste had confessed, her voice thick with despair. "It's all he talks about. The legacy, the Sinclair name. When he finds out I can't give him that, he'll leave me. I'll be back on the street, Nia. I can't go back." It was Nia who first planted the seed, a dark, dangerous whisper of an idea. What if you could give him one? Or make him think you could? The scheme they concocted was audacious, a high-wire act of deception. It began with small lies, a faked medical history, a positive pregnancy test bought online. Then came the centerpiece of the fraud, a hyper-realistic silicone prosthetic, custom-ordered from a special effects company designed to grow incrementally over 9 months. They spent hours researching, coaching Celeste on the symptoms, the cravings, the proper way to waddle in the 3rd trimester. It was a full-time job, a performance that required constant vigilance. Nia, a medical clerk with access to hospital systems, helped her procure forged sonograms and doctor's notes. They found a disgraced doctor in New Orleans, Victor Rousseau, a man with a gambling addiction and a history of prescription fraud. A little bit of blackmail was all it took to get him on board to provide an official, though entirely false, medical paper trail. The goal was never just to stay with Jeremiah. It evolved into something more. As the months wore on, a bitter resentment took root in Celeste's heart. She saw the ease with which Jeremiah moved through the world, the power his name and money afforded him. She thought of her own painful past, the years of fear and poverty she had endured simply for being who she was. The plan morphed from a shield of protection into a sword of retribution. This wasn't just about security anymore. It was about compensation. "He owes me this," she told Nia, her voice hard. "The world owes me this, for everything I've been through. The warehouse. That's my severance package. It's my reparation for a lifetime of being treated as less than human." This twisted logic became her mantra, the justification that allowed her to look Jeremiah in the eye every day, to accept his gentle caresses on her fake pregnant belly, and to feign the joy of a mother-to-be, all while plotting the most intimate and devastating betrayal imaginable. Jeremiah Sinclair hadn't built his empire on naivety. His success was forged in boardrooms where he could read a man's intentions in the subtle shift of his eyes or the slight hesitation in his voice. He was a master of details, and in the 8th month of his wife's pregnancy, the details were starting to feel wrong. The cracks in Celeste's perfect performance were microscopic at first, hairline fractures and a flawless facade, but his finely tuned intuition began to register them as seismic tremors. It started with the doctor's appointments. Celeste always had a reason for him not to come. "It's just a routine checkup, darling. You're too busy," she'd say, or "Dr. Miller's office is so small, you'd be bored to tears." He'd acquiesced, trusting her. But a pattern was emerging. He had never once set foot in the obstetrician's office, had never heard his own child's heartbeat through the Doppler. He only saw the grainy black and white photos she brought home, smiling as she pointed out a tiny hand or foot. But now, looking at them, they felt generic, impersonal, like stock photos of a stranger's baby. Then there was the lack of movement. He would spend hours at night with his hand pressed gently against her belly, waiting. He'd read all the books. He knew that by this stage, the baby should be a tiny acrobat, kicking and turning. He yearned for that connection, that first tangible proof of the life he was so eager to welcome. But there was nothing, only stillness. "He's a very calm baby," Celeste would murmur, her voice a little too quick, a little too rehearsed. "Takes after his mother." But Jeremiah remembered her telling him stories of her supposed ballet days, of a restless energy she always had to channel. The pieces weren't fitting. His mother, Eleanor Sinclair, a woman as sharp and formidable as her son, did little to soothe his burgeoning unease. During her last visit, she'd watched Celeste with an unnerving intensity. "She doesn't carry it right," Eleanor had said to him later, in the privacy of his study. "A woman carrying a child moves from her core. It changes her center of gravity. Celeste. She moves like she's carrying a package, carefully, but it's not a part of her." Jeremiah had dismissed it as an old woman's rambling, but the words stuck, festering in the back of his mind. Carrying a package. The breaking point came on a Tuesday night. He was walking past the library when he heard Celeste's hushed voice through the slightly ajar door. She was on the phone with Nia again. He paused, not wanting to eavesdrop, but her tone caught his attention. It was the same clipped, anxious tone he'd heard on the veranda weeks ago. He could only catch snippets, disjointed phrases that made the hair on his arms stand up. "The package is secure. Timing has to be perfect for the final act." He heard her laugh, a short, sharp sound devoid of any real joy. "Don't worry, he won't suspect a thing until the curtain falls." Jeremiah pulled back from the door, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. Package. Final act. Curtain falls. It was theatrical language, the language of a performer. But what performance was she talking about? An icy dread, cold and sharp, pierced through his bubble of domestic bliss. His mother's words echoed in his ears. "She moves like she's carrying a package." Suddenly, the missed appointments, the serene stillness of his unborn son, the carefully constructed narrative of his wife's life, it all felt like a grand, elaborate stage play. And a terrifying suspicion began to dawn. He wasn't just a member of the audience, he was the unwitting subject of the entire production. The trust he had placed in her, as solid and foundational as the concrete of his warehouses, began to crumble into dust. The suspicion gnawed at Jeremiah, a corrosive acid eating away at his peace. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were haunted by stages and curtains, by the feel of his hand on a belly that felt strangely inert. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. A direct accusation without proof would be dismissed as the ramblings of an over-anxious father-to-be. He needed certainty. He needed to see behind the curtain himself. The decision was cold and calculated, made with the same ruthless efficiency that had defined his business dealings. The next morning, he had a state-of-the-art surveillance system installed in his home, citing a recent uptick in neighborhood crime. The main installation was a decoy. The real work was done by a specialist who, for a hefty price, installed a camera no larger than a screw head into the mahogany trim of the bookshelf in their shared home office, a room Celeste often used for her private calls. He waited for 2 days. It was the longest 48 hours of his life. He went through the motions, playing the part of the doting husband, kissing her goodbye in the morning, asking about her day in the evening, all while a storm of paranoia and dread raged within him. He felt like a stranger in his own home, an actor in a play where he no longer knew his lines. He watched the live feed from his phone in furtive glances, his heart lurching every time Celeste entered the office. For 2 days, he saw nothing but mundane activity. Celeste paying bills, browsing online, talking on the phone with friends. He started to feel a sliver of guilt, a flicker of hope that he was wrong, that he was losing his mind. Then came the third afternoon. Celeste had told him she was feeling exhausted and was going to lie down for a nap. Instead, Jeremiah watched on his phone as she walked into the office and closed the door firmly behind her. She went to the window, peered out through the blinds for a long moment, then turned back to the room. She sighed, a deep theatrical exhalation of weariness, and stretched her arms above her head. And then Jeremiah's world stopped. He watched, his breath caught in his throat, as she reached around her back, unfastened something, and with a grunt of relief, peeled the entire, perfectly round pregnant belly away from her body. The image on his phone was grainy, but the truth it revealed was shatteringly clear. She held the prosthetic in her hands for a moment before tossing it carelessly onto a leather armchair. Beneath it, her stomach was flat, toned, the body of a dancer, not a woman in her 8th month of pregnancy. His Samuel, his heir, his legacy, all of it vanished in an instant, revealed to be nothing more than a hollow piece of silicone. The sound on the feed crackled to life as she dialed her phone. It was Nia. God, I can't wait for this to be over. Celeste's voice, raw and unfiltered, filled his ears. This thing is so hot, and he's been so touchy-feely lately. He keeps trying to feel the baby kick. She laughed, a sound so cruel and mocking, it was like a physical blow. I'm starting the pre-labor pains tomorrow. By the weekend, I'll have my tragic little miscarriage, and we'll activate the trust. Our troubles will be over. Jeremiah sank into his office chair miles away, the phone slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering onto his desk. A wave of nausea washed over him. It wasn't just the lie of the pregnancy. It was the scope of it, the cold, calculating cruelty behind it. Every tender moment, every shared dream, every whispered promise for their future. It had all been a lie, a performance, an act. He wasn't her husband. He was her mark. The grief he felt was swiftly consumed by a new emotion, something cold and terrifyingly calm. The rage was there, a white-hot inferno burning deep in his soul, but on the surface, a chilling clarity settled over him. The curtain hadn't fallen yet. The performance wasn't over, and he had just decided on a new ending for their final act. In the days that followed the revelation, a terrifying transformation occurred within Jeremiah Sinclair. The warm, doting husband was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. On the outside, he was a study in calm concern, but inside, the inferno of his rage had cooled into a block of black ice. He didn't confront her. He didn't scream or rage. To do so would be to give her the satisfaction of a reaction, to cede control. Instead, he chose to become a ghost in his own life, a silent observer watching the final, grotesque act of her play unfold. He would not stop the performance. He would simply rewrite the ending. Celeste, oblivious to the fact that her audience was now fully aware of the deception, began her meticulously rehearsed descent into pre-labor. She started with small moans, a hand pressed to the small of her back. She complained of cramps and a pressure she'd read about on pregnancy blogs. Jeremiah played his part with chilling perfection. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of worry. He rubbed her back, brought her water, and spoke in soft, soothing tones, all while the image of her ripping off her prosthetic belly played on a continuous loop in his mind. Each touch was a lie, each word of comfort a venomous whisper. He was no longer her husband. He was her co-star in a grim tragedy of his own design. On Friday evening, the curtain rose on the main event. They were finishing a silent dinner when Celeste let out a sharp cry, her fork clattering onto her plate. She clutched her fake belly, her face contorting in a convincing display of agony. "Jeremiah!" she gasped, her eyes wide with feigned panic. I think it's starting. It's too early." Jeremiah rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, almost robotic. "Okay, baby, okay. Breathe. We'll go to the hospital, just like we planned." His voice was unnervingly steady, the calm at the center of her manufactured storm. He helped her to her feet, his touch gentle, his expression one of deep concern. "Let me get your hospital bag," he said. As she shuffled toward the door, leaning heavily on the furniture, he walked upstairs. In their bedroom, the bag sat packed and ready by the door. He picked it up, but instead of taking it straight to the car, he placed it on the bed and unzipped it. Inside, tucked beneath a baby blanket and a set of tiny pajamas, was a small toiletries kit. He opened it. Nestled inside were 2 small vials of what looked like dark, viscous liquid. Theatrical blood. The final prop for her final scene. He stared at it for a long moment, the coldness inside him solidifying into something hard and unbreakable. He zipped the bag and walked out. The drive was surreal. Celeste kept up her moans, her breaths coming in staged, ragged pants. Jeremiah drove, his hands steady on the wheel of his black Escalade. He didn't take the main highway. Instead, he turned onto a narrow 2-lane road that cut through the dense, swampy low country west of the city. Spanish moss dripped from the cypress trees, creating a dark, claustrophobic tunnel. "Jeremiah, where are you going?" "The hospital is the other way," Celeste said, a flicker of genuine confusion in her voice. "It's a shortcut, baby," he replied, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "You mentioned it the other day, remember? Said Nia told you it would be faster. We need to get there as quickly as possible." He was using her own words, her own carefully laid breadcrumbs, against her. She had planned the route for her fake miscarriage, the perfect deserted spot. And he was driving her there, not as a panicked husband, but as an executioner. The Escalade plunged deeper into the oppressive darkness, a steel chariot on its way to a final, unscheduled performance. The air in the Escalade grew thick with unspoken tension, far heavier than the humid night outside. Celeste's feigned moans of pain began to taper off, replaced by a nervous silence as the cypress swamp closed in around them. The road was a ribbon of cracked asphalt, swallowed by darkness on either side. There were no streetlights, no other cars, only the unnerving chorus of insects and the distant bellow of a bullfrog. This was the isolation she had planned for, but now, seated next to the stone-faced, silent version of her husband, it felt less like a stage and more like a trap. "Jeremiah, I need you to stop," she stammered, her voice taking on a genuine edge of panic. "Right now, I feel like I'm going to be sick. It's urgent." It was her cue, the line she had rehearsed to get out of the car and stage her miscarriage. Jeremiah complied without a word. He pulled the heavy SUV onto the gravel shoulder, the crunch of the tires unnaturally loud in the profound silence. He killed the engine and the headlights, plunging them into near-total blackness, save for the sliver of a pale moon filtering through the dense canopy above. "I'll help you," he said, his voice a dead monotone. "No!" Celeste's reply was too sharp, too fast. She fumbled with the door handle. "I need privacy. I'll just be a minute. Over there, in the trees." She scrambled out of the car, clutching her hospital bag, and hurried toward a thicket of palmettos and tangled vines just off the road. She didn't look back. If she had, she would have seen Jeremiah exit the vehicle as silently as a predator, his large frame melting into the shadows. He followed her, his footsteps making no sound on the soft, damp earth. Hidden by the broad leaves of a palmetto, he watched her. The performance was over. With frantic, clumsy movements, she dropped the bag, ripped open the front of her dress, and began unstrapping the prosthetic belly. Just as she pulled it free, a small vial of theatrical blood slipped from her bag and shattered on a tree root, splashing a dark crimson stain across the front of her white dress. She swore under her breath. And that's when Jeremiah stepped out of the darkness. "Is this part of the show, Celeste?" His voice was a low, chilling whisper that cut through the night. She spun around, a strangled gasp escaping her lips. In one hand, she held the hollow shell of their fictional son. The other was frozen mid-reach for another vial. The moonlight cast his face in harsh shadows, his eyes black, bottomless pits of cold fury. "Jeremiah, I can explain," she began, her voice trembling. "Explain what?" He took a step closer, his presence immense, suffocating. "Explain the silicone baby? The fake blood? Or should we start with the warehouse you were planning to steal after my son tragically died?" Tears of genuine terror now streamed down her face. All the lies, all the deceptions fell away, leaving only a raw, desperate fear. "It's not what you think. I had to. You don't know what my life has been like." The confession tumbled out of her in a torrent of panicked words, a desperate last-ditch effort to find some purchase of pity. "I can't have children, Jeremiah. I never could, because I wasn't born a woman." The words hung in the humid air, a final, shocking revelation. "I'm transgender. I was so afraid you'd find out and leave me. I did it all because I love you, I swear." For Jeremiah, this was the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't just about the money or the fake baby anymore. His entire marriage, his intimacy, his very identity as a husband and a soon-to-be father. It was all a fraud, built on a foundation he couldn't even comprehend. The cold control inside him finally shattered, unleashing the white-hot rage that had been simmering beneath. "Love?" He spat the word like poison. He lunged forward. Celeste screamed, a raw, piercing sound that was swallowed by the dense swamp. He grabbed her by the throat, his powerful hands closing around her slender neck. Her nails raked at his arms, drawing blood. But he didn't feel it. All he felt was the pulsating thrum of betrayal and a singular, destructive need to silence the source of his humiliation forever. The struggle was brief and brutal. The last thing Celeste Fontaine saw was not the face of the man she loved, but a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, illuminated by the cold, indifferent light of the moon. Then there was only the suffocating darkness of the swamp. Jeremiah drove back to his palatial home in a daze, the silence in the car a screaming accusation. He methodically cleansed the scene of his life, burning the silicone prosthetic and the hospital bag in the deep fireplace of his study until all that remained was a foul-smelling, molten lump of plastic and ash. The next morning, he called the police. His voice was a masterful performance of distress. His pregnant wife, Celeste, was gone. They'd had a small argument, he claimed, about her family's visit. She was hormonal, emotional. He'd woken up and she, her car, and her bags were gone. He thought she'd driven to New Orleans to blow off steam, but she wasn't answering her phone. The case landed on the desk of Detective Raymond Donnelly, a 20-year veteran of the Savannah PD. Donnelly was a man steeped in the old ways, with a cynical view of the world and a low-grade, simmering prejudice he would have fiercely denied possessing. He saw Jeremiah Sinclair, the immaculate suit, the expensive watch, the articulate speech, and he saw a pillar of the community, a success story. He listened to Jeremiah's tale of a moody, flighty pregnant wife and nodded along. It fit a narrative he was comfortable with. In his mind, the case was simple. A domestic spat, a dramatic wife who would turn up in a few days with a sheepish apology. The fact that the Sinclair family was one of the most prominent black families in the city only made him more cautious, more inclined to take the husband's word at face value to avoid any accusations of racial bias. Days turned into a week, then 2. Celeste's car was found abandoned in a bus station parking lot in Jacksonville, Florida, a deliberate misdirection Jeremiah had orchestrated in the hours after the murder. This discovery only solidified Donnelly's theory. She ran, he told his younger, more eager partner. Got cold feet about the baby, the marriage, whatever. She'll pop up when the money runs out. He treated the case with a frustrating lack of urgency. The initial searches were cursory, focused around the bus station and known hangouts in Savannah. The dense alligator-infested swamps lining the back roads were dismissed as improbable. No delicate little ballerina is running off into a swamp, Donnelly had scoffed. The media, however, was not so easily placated. Celeste Sinclair was beautiful, her husband was powerful, and the story of a missing, heavily pregnant socialite was pure catnip for the local news. The headlines grew more insistent, the questions more pointed. Why wasn't more being done? Where was the massive search effort? The pressure began to mount, not just from the media, but from within the community. Jeremiah played the part of the grieving, desperate husband to perfection, holding press conferences on the steps of his mansion, his voice cracking as he pleaded for his wife's safe return. His performance was so convincing that public opinion was firmly on his side. He was the victim, the stoic husband abandoned by an unstable wife. Detective Donnelly found himself backed into a corner. His superiors were feeling the heat, and his dismissive attitude was starting to look like incompetence. He was forced to ramp up the investigation, re-interviewing Jeremiah, talking to Celeste's friends, digging into her past. But every lead was a dead end. The version of Celeste that Jeremiah had presented to the world was flawless, a ghost with no enemies and no secrets. The investigation stalled, bogged down by Donnelly's initial bias and Jeremiah's cunning misdirection. Celeste Fontaine had vanished, and the Savannah PD seemed to be chasing a phantom, looking everywhere except the one place where the darkness had swallowed her whole. The truth lay rotting under a blanket of mud and leaves, waiting for a break that had nothing to do with human intuition and everything to do with a far more primal sense. 6 weeks after Celeste's disappearance, the case was colder than a morgue slab. Detective Donnelly was out of leads and out of patience, fielding daily calls from the chief and the mayor's office. The file on his desk was thick with dead ends. It was during a particularly frustrating morning briefing that a young tech-savvy officer named Hale spoke up. "Detective," he began, hesitant but determined, "we haven't exhausted every option. We haven't brought in a cadaver dog." Donnelly shot him a withering look over his reading glasses. "A dog? We've had dozens of officers comb this county. You want me to waste resources on a K-9 unit because you've been watching too much TV?" The dismissal was sharp, but the suggestion lingered. The public was hungry for action, for any sign that the police were trying something, anything new. With a sigh of theatrical resignation, Donnelly approved the request, more as a public relations move than with any real hope of a breakthrough. It felt like a Hail Mary pass in a game he had already lost. That's how Officer Hale and his partner, a magnificent sable-colored German shepherd named Coda, found themselves at the edge of the low-country swamp off the old highway. Hale was Coda's handler, but anyone who watched them work knew it was a partnership of equals. Coda was not a pet. He was a highly trained instrument of discovery, his nose capable of detecting the chemical compounds of human decomposition from hundreds of yards away, even through soil and water. While human search parties had stuck to the paths of least resistance, Coda was drawn to the wild, untamed places. Hale gave the command, "Find," and the dog went to work. Coda moved with a fluid, focused intensity, his nose hovering just above the damp earth, quartering the ground in a zigzag pattern. The air was thick and still, broken only by the buzzing of insects and Hale's quiet words of encouragement. They moved deeper into the swamp, the ground growing softer, the vegetation thicker. This was territory the initial search teams had barely penetrated, deeming it too difficult and dangerous. For 2 hours, they found nothing. Donnelly, who had reluctantly come to observe, was already shaking his head, his skepticism validated. And then, Coda's entire demeanor changed. He froze mid-stride, his head snapping to the left. His tail went rigid, and a low whine emanated from deep in his chest. He took off, crashing through a thicket of ferns with Hale running to keep up. Coda led them to a small, almost imperceptible clearing, a place where the ground seemed slightly disturbed. He began to circle a specific spot, his whining growing more insistent. Before he sat, looked directly at Hale, and let out a single, sharp, authoritative bark. It was his final alert, the signal that his search was over. Donnelly and the other officers arrived moments later. At first, they saw nothing but mud and leaf litter, but as they looked closer at the spot Coda had indicated, they noticed the soil was looser, darker. A forensic team was called in, and they began to dig carefully. The cloying, sweet smell of decay, faint at first, grew stronger with every shovel of earth they removed. Less than 2 feet down, their tools hit something soft. They switched to hand trowels, gently brushing away the mud. First, they uncovered a piece of white fabric, stained dark brown. Then, a human hand, its pale skin a stark contrast to the black earth. The search for Celeste Sinclair was over. Coda sat patiently by Officer Hale's side, panting softly, oblivious to the gravity of his discovery. He had simply done his job. He had found what the humans could not, and in doing so, had just blown Jeremiah Sinclair's carefully constructed world wide open. The discovery of the body in the swamp transformed the missing persons case into a full-blown homicide investigation, and the shift in Detective Donnelly was palpable. The lazy cynicism was gone, replaced by a cold, focused anger at the killer, but also at himself for being so easily misled. The autopsy report landed on his desk like a bomb. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. But it was the second finding that stunned the entire department. The victim, Celeste Fontaine, was a transgender woman. She had undergone gender confirmation surgery years prior. Furthermore, she had not been pregnant. There was no sign of a fetus, no indication she had ever carried a child. The lie was suddenly exposed in all its shocking complexity. Jeremiah Sinclair's narrative of a hormonal, pregnant wife who ran away didn't just seem unlikely anymore. It was an impossibility. Donnelly realized he hadn't been dealing with a grieving husband. He had been manipulated by a cunning and ruthless killer. His professional pride stung, he threw himself into the case with a new, relentless ferocity. His first stop was Celeste's cousin, Nia, in New Orleans. Faced with the news of Celeste's murder and the undeniable proof of the police investigation, Nia's composure shattered. In a marathon interrogation session, sobbing and terrified, she confessed the entire sordid plan. She told them about Celeste's past, the fear, the desperation that morphed into greed. She detailed the scheme with the prosthetic belly, the theatrical blood, and the ultimate goal: to fake a miscarriage and use Jeremiah's grief and guilt to secure the warehouse trust. She was just scared, Nia wept. She never thought it would end like this. She wouldn't hurt a fly. But she was willing to commit massive fraud and emotionally devastate her husband, Donnelly countered, his voice hard. That sounds like hurting someone to me. Nia's testimony gave them their next crucial link, Dr. Victor Rousseau. When two Savannah detectives showed up at his shabby New Orleans clinic, the disgraced doctor folded almost immediately. He admitted to falsifying medical records for Celeste in exchange for money to pay off his gambling debts. He provided copies of the fake sonograms and doctored reports he had created. A complete paper trail of the pregnancy that never was. The web of deceit was unraveling thread by thread. Back in Savannah, Donnelly's team executed a search warrant on the Sinclair estate. This time, they weren't looking for signs of a missing person. They were looking for evidence of a murder. While the house itself was pristine, the forensics team focused on the grand fireplace in Jeremiah's study. Deep within the ash, they found it, a small, hardened, misshapen lump of black plastic. It was all that was left of the silicone prosthetic. Lab analysis would later confirm it was composed of materials consistent with high-grade theatrical props. They seized Jeremiah's computers and phones, and a tech analyst quickly uncovered his purchase history. The discreet order for the high-end micro camera placed just days before Celeste's disappearance. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when they pulled the GPS data from his Escalade. On the night Celeste vanished, the vehicle's location history showed a 37-minute stop on the deserted swamp road, precisely where Coda had found her body. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was a steel cage, closing in on Jeremiah Sinclair from all sides. With the evidence mounting, Detective Donnelly brought Jeremiah Sinclair back to the interrogation room at the Savannah PD headquarters. The room was small, gray, and deliberately devoid of comfort. This time, there was no deference, no cautious handling of a community pillar. Jeremiah walked in with the same air of unshakable confidence he wore in his boardrooms. His suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. He believed he was untouchable, insulated by his wealth and his carefully crafted image. He was wrong. Donnelly began not with accusations, but with facts, laying out pieces of evidence on the metal table between them, like a dealer laying out a winning hand. First, the GPS data from the Escalade, a red dot marking the exact location and time of the stop on the swamp road. Jeremiah's lawyer objected, but Jeremiah simply waved him off with a flick of his wrist. "I pulled over. Celeste was feeling ill," he said, his voice smooth as polished marble. Next, Donnelly laid down a forensics report, accompanied by a photo of the melted lump of plastic found in his fireplace. "Our lab identified this as the remains of a silicone prosthetic, the kind used in filmmaking, or to fake a pregnancy." Jeremiah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first crack in his iron facade. Then came the autopsy report. Donnelly slid it across the table. "The ME found your wife died of strangulation, Mr. Sinclair. He also found that she was not pregnant, and he found that she was a transgender woman." He let that hang in the air, watching Jeremiah's reaction. For the first time, a flicker of raw emotion, shock, confusion, fury, crossed his face before he suppressed it. "That's a lie! That's impossible!" he whispered, more to himself than to the detective. The final card was the signed, sworn confession from Nia, detailing every aspect of their plan, from its inception to its intended fraudulent conclusion. Donnelly pressed a button on a small recorder. Nia's voice, full of grief and guilt, filled the small room, recounting conversations, dates, and details that only a co-conspirator would know. The weight of it all, the GPS, the melted plastic, the autopsy, Nia's betrayal, finally broke him. The facade of the calm, grieving husband crumbled, revealing the raging, humiliated man beneath. Jeremiah Sinclair leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, and the confession poured out of him, not as an apology, but as a justification. "She made a fool of me," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that was still fresh. "My whole life, I built something real, something with honor. My name meant something, and she turned it all into a joke, a circus." He recounted the night in the swamp, not with remorse, but with a chilling sense of righteousness. He described the moment he saw her with the fake belly, the moment she confessed her truth. "She didn't just lie to me about a baby, she lied to me about everything. Who she was, what she was, our marriage, our bed, it was all a lie." In his mind, her deception was a wound so deep, so fundamentally emasculating, that his violent reaction was not murder, but a righteous act of reclamation, of erasing the source of his shame. He wasn't confessing to a crime, he was explaining a necessity. When he finally fell silent, the air in the room was thick with the poison of his hatred and his broken pride. Detective Donnelly looked at the man across the table, no longer a titan of industry, but a common killer, undone by his own rage. He nodded to the officer at the door. "It's over." Jeremiah didn't resist as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The fall was complete. The trial of Jeremiah Sinclair was a media sensation, a Savannah Gothic tale of wealth, secrets, and murder that captivated the nation. The prosecution laid out the case with methodical precision, presenting the damning GPS data, the forensic evidence from the fireplace, and the heartbreaking testimony of Naya, who took the stand against the man her cousin had deceived. The defense tried to paint Celeste as a manipulative grifter and Jeremiah as a man who snapped under the weight of an unimaginable betrayal. But they could not justify the cold, calculated violence of his actions. He hadn't acted in a moment of hot-blooded passion. He had followed her into the dark, cornered her, and deliberately extinguished her life. The jury found Jeremiah Sinclair guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, citing the brutal nature of the crime and the calculated deception that followed, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, stripped of his tailored suit and his aura of invincibility, he was just another inmate, his legacy no longer one of entrepreneurial genius, but of murderous rage. The Sinclair logistics empire, once a symbol of black excellence and hard-won success, was left in turmoil, its name forever tarnished by the scandal. The story left the city of Savannah grappling with uncomfortable truths. It became a tragedy with no true heroes, only victims of varying degrees of their own making. Celeste Fontaine, born Charles, had spent a lifetime fighting for a place in the world, only to resort to a devastating deception born of fear and a twisted desire for justice. Her lies, while inexcusable, were rooted in a deep-seated trauma that many struggled to understand. Her pursuit of security ultimately led her to a shallow grave in a swamp, her identity revealed only in death. Jeremiah Sinclair, a man who had overcome societal barriers to build an empire, became a prisoner of his own rigid ideals of masculinity, legacy, and honor. His pride, the very engine of his success, proved to be his fatal flaw. When confronted with a betrayal that struck at the core of his identity, he couldn't bend. He could only break, and in breaking, he destroyed everything he had ever built, including his own humanity. In the end, the case of the perfect couple who never was serves as a dark and enduring lesson. It teaches us that deceit, no matter the justification, is a poison that corrupts everything it touches. It rots relationships from the inside out, turning love into suspicion and trust into a weapon. It demonstrates that the wounds of betrayal can cut deeper than any blade, capable of twisting a good man into a monster. But it also offers a final, stark moral. No lie, no matter how profound, and no betrayal, no matter how painful, can ever justify the act of taking another human life. Rage is a fire that consumes everything, but most of all, it consumes the person who wields it, leaving behind nothing but ashes and a legacy of deceit.